Elliott Hughes is a political commentator and senior associate with Summa Strategies. He's a former senior advisor to Liberal finance and defense ministers. Former Alberta MLA and cabinet minister Gary Mara is here. He's the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Anne McGrath is national director of the NDP, and Robert Fife is the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Hi, everyone. Good to see you tonight. Bob, I'll start with you. When I spoke to Mark Regev earlier on the show, he seemed to actually walk back a little bit of the criticism and say, oh, he wasn't trying to make it personal, even though Mr. Netanyahu tagged the prime minister. In any event, it did garner a lot of reaction. Why do you think the prime minister made the comments he did when he did?
Well, look, I think the world is struck by the horrific violence that is going on in Gaza. And the images are really difficult to deal with. The Prime Minister also has a caucus that is deeply divided about this issue between Jewish members and Arab Canadians and others who are concerned about this. So, he came out with a really, really strong statement, and there was a pretty strong backlash from Israel and the Jewish community. And the argument is, with some legitimacy here, is that the Americans and the Israelis say there are command centers below that hospital. They have to go in and clean it out. The Prime Minister was willing to accept the word of the United States when it came to India assassinating or murdering a Canadian citizen. The argument is, why don't you accept the word of the United States when they say that Hamas has militants in a command center below that hospital. So Israel is going to go in there, because if they are in fact below in that hospital, that changes the whole equation whether these are war crimes or not. Because if they are hiding behind civilians, I think they'll have a strong argument to say they were justified in doing so.
Yeah, I think, Anne, there's the technicalities of it. And then, like Bob said, there's the images that Canadians are confronted with right now, which I sense are pretty overwhelming for people. And I think they have increased the pressure on the prime minister, the pressures that Bob was talking about, for example, from members of his own caucus, or even after he went for dinner when 250 people swarmed him in a restaurant, demanding that he call for a ceasefire. He inches closer to it without actually saying it, which I imagine must be a response to some of that pressure.
Absolutely, there's pressure. There's pressure, I think, on every political leader during a period like this. I think that people in Israel and in Gaza are living through a nightmare. They're the people who have been murdered, but there's the unrelenting images of and reality of what's going on in Gaza, and the after effects of what happened after the Hamas attack in Tel Aviv and in some of the kibbutzes. And of course, added to the pressure for the Prime Minister, I think, is the fact that we had the news just yesterday, I think it was, or earlier this week, that one of the people that we had hoped, it's a terrible thing to say that people were hoping that she had been taken hostage, and it turns out that she was actually murdered in the attack by Hamas. Vivian Silver from Winnipeg, who had been living in Israel for the last 50 years or so. So I think that news was very shocking and very heart-wrenching for a lot of people. I mean, I was there when we met with her son, and we were hopeful that not only would she be released as a hostage, but also hopeful because of the kind of life that she led, her commitment to peace, her ability to work.
That's the irony of it all. Her whole life's work was about peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
And her ability to work between the two communities, and I just think that was really a big impetus as well. And Bob is right. There is also a lot of pressure and division within the Liberal caucus about how to deal with this. But it was definitely stepped up last night.
Yeah, like it was a departure, Elliott, from. It was a departure from what we'd heard so far. And I think the other reason it was of note is because it wasn't as though it was in response to a series of questions from reporters. The Prime Minister made that statement very specifically in advance of his comments on an economic announcement, before any questions from reporters, which tells me there's some intent there.
Yeah, absolutely. That was what struck me as well. I mean, he was reading almost from a script or from notes. He wanted to get a statement out. And I think it reflects what, both Anne and Bob have said. I think it reflects a bit of a changing mood. And I think it reflects, frankly, where a lot of Canadians are on this issue. I don't know if they're quite, at that sort of ceasefire point, but there is this, this push and pull around this issue. And the Prime Minister in his comments, has made it very clear. And I think, frankly, I think where a lot of the world is. I mean, if you you look at a UN vote just a couple of days ago, Canada was one of the only countries sort of siding with Israel in not calling for a ceasefire, so to speak. And I think that felt a little bit out of step of where the majority of the world is. And that's a challenge for the Prime Minister to manage. He also has that added complexity of having to manage the U.S. relationship as well and sort of standing shoulder to shoulder with them. So that also brings a bit of a difficult move. And so this whole situation has evolved, I would say, over the last 4 to 5, 6 weeks, where I think at the beginning it was very clear, the statements were very clear, it was sort of on the side of Israel to defend itself. And as we've seen over the last few weeks, and as these images have come out of that part of the world, it's become harder and harder in a way to hold that line. And I think what you're seeing is not only a reflection from the Prime Minister of where his caucus is, but also where the world is, and frankly, where Canadians are.
I think the challenge there, politically speaking, Gary, is that us regular Canadians can hold many of those same thoughts at one time, right? We can be horrified at what happened to Israel and also horrified at what's happening in Gaza. But political leaders often have to take a more specific stance, and you can almost see the Prime Minister up against that challenge with the way in which his own rhetoric has, the departure of his own rhetoric in the last 24 hours.
I think you're right, Vassy, but before I get into that, I want to sort of go back to something that Anne talked about, and that's Vivian Silver. I'm in your Winnipeg studios today, and it is a tragedy that a woman who dedicated her life to peace among Palestinians and Jews, a woman who would take sick Palestinians from Gaza and drive them to hospitals in Israel for treatment, I think is a great loss. This is a great Canadian that we should be mourning the loss of, who was murdered by Hamas, quite frankly. With respect to the politics of it, it is challenging. The Prime Minister does face a great challenge within his caucus among Canadians, but my sense would be that if Canadians had a stronger sense that our foreign policy was well thought out, serious, and not reactionary, we would have less of a concern about the criticism of another foreign leader of our Prime Minister, be it Xi Jinping, be it Prime Minister Modi, be it Benjamin Netanyahu. I think it's important for a deeper development of foreign policy. And the reason why I think that's important is that every time the Prime Minister says something, it seems to diminish our standing in the world. He looks increasingly isolated in this, and I think that foreign policy doesn't necessarily win you domestic votes, but it is something really important to focus on.